Reformed thinking. Welcome you to this deep dive. Our sources today are taking on a really ambitious piece of historical theology. We're looking at that huge, nearly 600-year span from the Babylonian captivity right up to the birth of Christ.
It's an era that can feel a bit quiet in the biblical narrative.
Exactly. It often feels like a gap. But
Yeah.
when you look at it through the framework someone like Jonathan Edwards provides, you see it's anything but quiet. So our mission is to look for the intentional preparations God was making during this very chaotic age for the king's arrival. We're looking for the hand of providence in politics, in religion, and even in human philosophy.
And it really is a phenomenal stretch of time to study, mostly because of how the divine record itself changes. Edwards calls it the last subordinate period of the Old Testament. And what makes it so distinct is this shift in communication.
A shift from what to what?
Well, for over 400 of those 600 years, the stream of inspired scripture history, the books of Kings, Samuel, Chronicles, it just dries up.
It stopped.
It stops completely. But the work of redemption doesn't.
Yeah.
The way we track God's plan just shifts from historical narrative to incredibly dense and detailed prophecy. And that structure alone tells you just how sovereignly guided this whole period was.
Okay, let's unpack that because it really addresses a big question about that gap in the record. If these 600 years were so vital, why the silence? Why would God stop providing a continuous, inspired history?
That seems a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. You'd think that's exactly when Israel would need an inspired history to keep them anchored.
Right. But the answer shows God's incredible consistency. The chain of events, the plan of redemption, it continues unbroken even when the historian's pen is put down.
So something takes its place.
Prophecy takes its place. In fact, if you look at the whole canon, this specific period is the subject of more detailed scripture prophecy than all the previous periods combined.
From prophets like Daniel and Ezekiel.
Daniel, Ezekiel, the post-exilic prophets, yeah. And their predictions focus so heavily on the sequence of these huge global empires, the fate of God's people inside them, and the precise timing of the Messiah.
So instead of a history book, God provided an inspired roadmap of the future. But you mentioned there's a deeper reason for this shift. Why halt the writing of history at all?
Well, the sources point to two connected reasons. The first is simply divine will. God willed that the spirit of prophecy, in that specific form, would cease for a time. So no inspired history could be written.
Okay.
And that leads to the second and, I think, more surprising reason. It has to do with timing, with synchronization.
The synchronization with human history. This is where God's sovereignty and human cultural development intersect, and it's fascinating.
It really is. The sources point out that the end of inspired history lines up perfectly with the start of what we could call authentic profane history.
Secular history.
Secular history, exactly. Before the Babylonian captivity, what we have from secular sources is, well, it's mostly fabulous and uncertain. It's myth mixed with fact. There's no real chronology. History as a rigorous discipline just hadn't been developed by man yet.
So when human history was unreliable, God provided the reliable record in Scripture. Genesis, Exodus, Kings.
Precisely. But then, around 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar, you see the rise of the Greek historical age. Men like Herodotus, Thucydides, they start standardizing how records are kept. They use chronology. They try to verify their sources.
So this is the beginning of what the Greeks and Romans would consider real, verifiable history.
Yes. And just as that's happening, God steps back from writing history and provides prophecy instead.
So how does that work in practice? How do the prophecies and these new secular records interact?
Well, by switching to prophecy, God set up this undeniable proof for later generations. He lets events unfold, and they get recorded by two sources at once: the prophets in advance and the newly reliable human historians in real time.
So when people later read Daniel's prophecies about the four empires,
Right.
and then they compare them to the detailed accounts from Greek and Roman historians, the agreement is just breathtaking. It's perfect.
That comparison would show that God isn't just speaking, he's ruling. He's orchestrating every detail of these huge geopolitical shifts. It's not just random chance.
Not at all. And it also prepared the world intellectually. Think of the early Christian apologists. They could go to the most educated Romans and Greeks and say, look, you trust your historians, right? You trust Livy. Now read our prophet Daniel. He predicted the entire sequence of Persia, Greece, and Rome centuries before they happened. The perfect match proves there's a divine author behind it all. So this wasn't a narrative silence. It was a really sophisticated method of verification for a world that was starting to value written records.
That level of orchestration is just incredible, and it brings us right to the actual content of that era. This wasn't a peaceful time. It was an age of what our sources call great revolutions. Continual convulsion. The world was constantly being shaken, just like Isaiah chapter 24 said it would be turned upside down.
The sheer instability is a major theme. I mean, we're talking about the greatest series of revolutions since the flood.
And it starts, interestingly, with God's own visible church, Babylonian captivity. But then, as Jeremiah prophesied, the cup went round to all the other nations. The shaking starts with Israel, and then it expands.
And what was the purpose of all this chaos?
To prepare the world for the only stable kingdom, the kingdom of Christ.
And these convulsions are marked out by those four great global overturnings. The ones Daniel saw in his visions: Nebuchadnezzar's statue, the gold, silver, brass, iron, and the four beasts.
Right. So after Babylon, the golden head falls, you get the first great overturning, the Persian Empire under Cyrus.
The silver.
The silver, a much bigger empire ruling over God's captive people. Then comes the second overturning, the explosive rise of the Grecian Empire.
The brass. And Daniel's prophecy of the swift he-goat that doesn't touch the ground, that's a perfect picture of Alexander the Great's conquests.
It is. His speed was legendary.
Yeah.
And he overthrew the Persians, expanded even further, and just fundamentally changed the world.
And then the third and final one, the mightiest of all.
The Roman Empire. The iron. It crushes and breaks in pieces the Greek kingdoms that came after Alexander. Rome was stronger, bigger, and more powerful than anything that had come before. This sequence, one conquering the next, it just showed instability at the highest level of human power.
They were world rulers, but they just fell like dominoes.
They did. And that set the stage for a spiritual kingdom that would never fall.
So what's the theological meaning in that specific pattern? 3 big overthrows after the Jewish monarchy was removed. Why that number?
The key is in Ezekiel chapter 21. I will overturn it until he come whose right it is.
Overturned 3 times?
3 times. It refers to the removal of the diadem, the crown from the house of David. The supreme temporal power was taken away. And that repetition seems to correspond exactly to the 3 great empires, Persia, Greece, and Rome, that would hold that symbolic crown until the true king arrived.
So those centuries of war weren't just random. The world was sort of passing the crown from one kingdom to the next, waiting for the son of David, for Christ to come and claim it.
It's like the world was in labor. That's the metaphor the sources use from Haggai. The shaking of the nations was the world in travail birth pangs, leading to the delivery of the Son of God. The suffering was showing the world its own misery and its absolute need for a Prince of Peace.
And in the middle of this, it's mentioned that God allowed Satan's visible kingdom, these huge heathen monarchies, to rise to their absolute peak strength. Why let the enemy become so powerful right before Christ comes? That seems risky.
It was all about the contrast. It was designed to make Christ's spiritual victory that much more glorious. By letting earthly power reach its greatest height, its greatest splendor, the overthrow by a purely spiritual kingdom seems that much more amazing.
It's the strategy of conquering strength with what looks like weakness.
The David and Goliath analogy. Goliath comes out in all his armor, all his earthly might. David comes with a sling and a stone.
And the victory has to be seen as total.
Right. When Christ comes and establishes his kingdom, he's symbolically destroying that whole statue, the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, so they'll become like chaff, just blown away. These huge empires, for all their strength, were fundamentally unstable. And that instability served as a foil to Christ's kingdom, which, as Daniel said, shall never be destroyed.
And through all this geopolitical chaos, we have to mention the preservation of the Jewish people. They are right at the center of this storm, constantly being overrun and threatened, and yet they survive.
Their survival is a continuous miracle of providence. For 500 years, they are politically weak, navigating these global convulsions. And their preservation, especially through that vicious persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes, was a real-time proof that God keeps his covenant. They lost their earthly crown, but their existence was sustained by a greater hand.
That distinction between the external political shaking and the internal covenant preservation is a great transition to our next point. While the world was being turned upside down, God was also systematically removing the external glory of the Jewish system itself.
Yes, clearing the way internally for the arrival of the antitype for Christ.
And the first step was the Babylonian captivity. It finally cured the nation of its addiction to idolatry.
It's amazing, isn't it? After centuries of warnings, 70 years in Babylon finally did it. That deep humiliation of being subject to the heathen, of seeing their own temple destroyed by the servants of pagan gods, seems to have created a lasting disgust for idol worship.
So this was a kind of foreshadowing.
It was. As the time approached for the gospel to abolish idolatry across the whole world, God first abolished it among his own covenant people, a purification to make them ready for a spiritual king.
But the captivity also stripped away the physical grandeur, the temporal glory of the Old Testament?
It did. The first thing to go was the supreme dominion of the house of David. Ezekiel confirmed it. The crown and diadem were removed. The typical kings had to step aside because the everlasting king was about to reign.
And then there's the temple itself. The second temple, built by the exiles, was visibly inferior to Solomon's.
And that was on purpose. Since the glorious antitype of the temple Christ's own body was about to appear, it was fitting that the physical typical temple should have its visible glory diminished. It was functional, but it lacked the specific signs of God's physical presence from the Old Covenant.
Let's talk about those missing elements. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant, the centerpiece?
Well, the sources focus on what was lost from it. The 2 tables of the testimony, the 10 commandments written by God's own finger, they were lost during the captivity and never replaced. The law was preserved in the scrolls, but the divinely written tablets were gone.
What about the Urim and Thummim? It's something we hear about, but what was it exactly?
It was a device, likely stones on the high priest's breastplate, used to get a direct, immediate answer from God on national matters, a kind of divine oracle. And Ezra confirms it was absent in the Second Temple.
So the direct line of communication in that form was cut.
It was, in anticipation of Christ, who is himself the great word, the ultimate oracle of God.
And most striking of all, the visible presence of God was gone. The Shekinah.
The Shekinah, that glorious cloud that rested over the mercy seat in Solomon's temple, it wasn't there in the Second Temple. The physical manifestation was removed. But this absence was tied directly to a greater promise.
The one in Haggai.
Exactly. God promised to fill that second house with a glory that surpassed the first, but in a new way, by the desire of all nations coming to it.
Christ himself.
His physical, incarnate presence, teaching and working miracles in that temple was the fulfillment of that promise. The symbol, the cloud, was no longer needed because the substance had arrived.
And finally, the holy fire. The fire from heaven.
The fire that consumed the first sacrifices and was never supposed to go out. It was extinguished when the first temple was destroyed. The priest had to use common fire after that. So you add it all up. The crown, the tablets, the oracle, the glory cloud, the sacred fire. It was a systematic dimming of the Old Testament lights. The symbols were setting because the Son of Righteousness was about to rise.
So while the old system's internal anchors were being removed, God was simultaneously setting up the external logistical preparations for the gospel. And the first one was the dispersion of the Jews.
This was not an accident. When Cyrus allowed the exiles to return, most of them didn't. They had built lives in Babylon and the surrounding regions. So only a small number went back to Jerusalem, leaving this huge Jewish diaspora scattered all over the Persian Empire.
A footprint that just kept expanding. By Esther's time, they're from India to Ethiopia. Then Antiochus the Great moves thousands of families to Asia Minor, places like Pontus, Galatia, Rome.
Places that become focal points for the Apostle Paul. And this dispersion prepared the way for the gospel in at least 4 key ways. First, the expectation of the Messiah became global news.
The dispersed Jews were carrying the scriptures and the prophecies with them.
Right. They were living and working among the Gentiles, talking about their law, and raising this general expectation of a great prince to be born in Judea. You even see it popping up in Roman writers like Virgil, who wrote about a world-changing prince coming from the east.
The second point is that the dispersion proved the ceremonial law was unsustainable. How did geography do that?
Just simple logistics. If you're a faithful Jew living 1,000 miles away, it's impossible to get to Jerusalem for the 3 mandatory feasts every year. It's impracticable. So distance itself showed that this landlocked system had to be replaced by a new dispensation that would work for all nations everywhere.
It was obsolete in practice before it was formally ended.
Exactly. Third, the dispersion meant that the key facts about Christ's life and death became public knowledge almost instantly across the world.
Because foreign Jews were still traveling to Jerusalem for the big feasts.
They were. They were there to see his miracles. They heard about Lazarus. They were certainly in the city for the crucifixion and Pentecost. And when they went back home to Parthia or Egypt or Rome, they carried that news with them.
And that leads to the fourth point, the synagogues. They became launch pads for the apostles.
The synagogues were everywhere. And they were perfect starting points. The apostles could walk in and immediately have an audience that already knew about the one true God, the moral law, and the messianic promises. And they also attracted curious Gentiles, the God-fearers, which gave the early church a ready-made bridge into the Gentile world.
The second huge preparation was linguistic, a common language across the known world thanks to Alexander the Great.
Alexander, the he-goat from Daniel's vision, created this massive empire. And his lasting legacy was making Koine Greek the common language of commerce, government, and intellectual life, from Egypt all the way to India.
So it was the ancient world's equivalent of an internet cable.
It really was. It created a communication highway. Churches in Jerusalem and Corinth could write to each other easily. But the most crucial part is that the New Testament itself was written in this common Greek. As soon as it was written, it was immediately accessible to most of the educated world. No waiting for translations.
And tied to that common language was the first major translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint.
Right. About 50 years or so after Alexander, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek. This was a monumental event. It unlocked the scriptures from a language only a minority understood into a world language.
And the early church used it constantly.
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, they're almost all taken directly from the Septuagint's wording, not a new translation from the Hebrew. For centuries, the Septuagint was the Bible for most Christians. It gave the early church a unified Old Testament to argue from.
Finally, there's the multiplication of the law itself. Before the captivity, copies were rare.
Very rare. But after the exile, largely because of Ezra's work, there was a revolution in distributing the word. Synagogues were established everywhere, and the law and the prophets were read constantly, every Sabbath. This was huge for preserving the people from idolatry and for creating a world that was familiar with the language and concepts of the covenant when the gospel finally arrived.
Okay, that brings us to the final century and a half before Christ, focusing on God's direct, sometimes violent, intervention to preserve his people and set the final stage.
Yes, and the examples are just amazing. They defy natural explanation. You have Alexander the Great marching on Jerusalem, furious with the Jews, ready to destroy them.
But he doesn't.
No. He meets the high priests, and God miraculously turns his heart. Instead of destroying the city, he shows it great favor. It's like Esau and Jacob all over again. The survival of the covenant people hung on the whim of a tyrant, and God changed his whim.
Then there's the even more dramatic story of Ptolemy Philopator in Egypt.
A state-sponsored attempt at genocide. He gathered thousands of Jews into the Hippodrome in Alexandria to have them trampled by 500 elephants.
It's a terrifying image.
It is. But the record says that by a wonderful providence, the elephants turned, not on the Jews, but on the spectators and the soldiers. The tyrant saw this divine intervention and was forced to stop.
But the worst persecution of the whole period came under Antiochus Epiphanes, the small horn from Daniel.
This was a unique kind of evil. Antiochus wasn't just trying to conquer the Jews. He was trying to eradicate their religion. He desecrated the temple, banned circumcision and the Sabbath, and burned copies of the law. It was a total war on their identity as God's people.
So how did they survive that?
God raised up the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. They were a tiny rebel force against a massive empire. But they performed the exploits Daniel foretold. They fought, they won impossible victories, and they cleansed the temple.
A clear sign of God's protection.
Absolutely. And Antiochus himself died a miserable death from a horrible disease, just as Daniel predicted. None shall help him. God preserved the seed line through its most vulnerable moments.
And as Greek power faded, the final player took the stage, Rome.
The Roman Empire. The Fourth Great Revolution. It established its power over Judea about 60 or 70 years before Christ, and it became the largest, most unified monarchy in history. Luke just calls it all the world.
And this unified government was a practical preparation for the gospel.
A perfect one. The famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, but also the infrastructure. The apostles could travel on Roman roads, under Roman law, with the level of safety and ease that would have been impossible if they had to cross dozens of little warring kingdoms.
And at the same time Rome was rising in military power, Greek and Roman philosophy were reaching their peak.
Yes, the Stoics, the Epicureans, all the major schools of thought were flourishing, and they were all focused on one question: how to find true human happiness through reason alone.
And they failed.
Hopelessly. They were divided into hundreds of different opinions. So God let human reason run its course for 600 years, push itself to its absolute limit to prove its own vanity. The result wasn't happiness. The world just grew more wicked and miserable.
It demonstrated the need for a divine teacher.
It did. It made foolish the wisdom of this world. Just as Paul later argued, it created an intellectual vacuum. But God didn't discard that learning. He prepared it to be a handmaid.
How so?
Well, you take someone like the Apostle Paul, who was trained in both Jewish law and Gentile philosophy. He could go to Athens and debate the philosophers on their own terms, even quoting their own poets. Once human reason was shown its limits, its tools could be used to articulate and defend the gospel.
So we come to the final moments. The Roman Empire is at its absolute height of power under Augustus Caesar.
Which fits God's strategy of contrast perfectly. He brings his own people, the Jews, very low, and he exalts the heathen world system to its greatest height, the crushing iron of the statue.
Why?
So that Christ, coming not as a Caesar, but in weakness and humility, could win a more glorious spiritual victory over the greatest earthly power imaginable.
And the final prelude to that birth was peace.
Universal peace. Augustus finally settled his empire, and in the very year Christ was born, the Romans performed the ceremony of shutting the temple of Janus, which was their symbol for a world at peace. And that peace lasted for 12 years. After centuries of constant war and overturning, the whole world was finally quiet.
A divinely orchestrated prelude for the Prince of Peace.
A perfect one.
So when you put it all together for us, what does this mean? We've seen the shift from history to prophecy, the four great overturnings, the stripping away of the old glories, the genius of the dispersion and the common language, and the peak of Roman power and Greek philosophy.
It reveals a meticulous sovereignty. Every major world event, from Cyrus to Augustus, from the Greek language to the Roman roads, was orchestrated for one moment. It shows you that the seeming chaos of world history isn't random. It serves a precise, sovereign purpose in God's plan of redemption. It's all guided.
God deliberately brought his own people low and exalted his enemies to their greatest height right before the incarnation. So consider what that approach, conquering the strongest earthly forces with the apparent weakness of a humble birth, tells us about the nature of Christ's kingdom and how it works today. It's a kingdom that shows its glory not by meeting earthly strength with greater earthly strength, but by overcoming and dissolving it when it's at its most magnificent. That approach, using weakness to conquer might, is the core truth you should think about long after this deep dive ends.